everyone, and welcome to the 15th episode of Our Tandem Talks. So for those of you who are new to Our Tandem, we are a progressive, continuous performance management platform. And this is our thought leadership webinar series where we invite different thought leaders, business leaders, and HR experts to join us and share all their thoughts and expertise. Today, we are doing something slightly different, and we just have the incredible Aisling Teillard, who is the CEO and founder of Our Tandem, to do an interactive session on how to transform your performance management. We want Aisling to be able to answer as many of your questions as possible, so please do use the chat box and the question function at the very bottom to ask any of your questions and offer all your thoughts. The session will run for 20 minutes, being Aisling presenting, and then the last part will be a Q&A session. So like I mentioned before, use the Q&A bit the bit at the bottom, and whilst Aisling's presenting, and then we'll make sure we answer all of your questions once she's finished her talk. Final thing from me is that this session is also going to be recorded, so I do hope that you enjoy the session today. I'm extremely excited to have her here, and I'd like to now hand over to you, Aisling.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and hello everybody. You're very welcome to Tandem Talks. I've been surprised at how many people want to hear a little bit more about the performance management journey and how to transform. And I'm hoping today's session I'll be able to share with you not just the trends and the academics, but some very real life world practices around what's happening, what works, what hasn't worked, and the pitfalls to avoid. So I'm hoping to pepper in as many stories and practical examples for you as I can throughout. But to kick off the formal agenda, here's what we're going to go through. So we are going to stop and talk a little bit about the trends, just to give some context. I know many of you will be familiar with them, but we'll add some context in. Also, that changing perceptions of employees and managers and what's that doing to performance management. So we'll touch on that as well. But then we'll get into the real practicalities of the key things you need to consider when you're transforming performance management, some of the pros and cons of going wild with some of those new trends, and indeed the pitfalls to avoid. And what I hope to leave you with is some very practical tools and ways that you can implement and support your performance management transformation. So that's what I'm hoping to cover in the next 25 minutes. I have a lot to get through, so I'm hoping I can get through everything. And as Lauren said, I'm really happy to take your comments, questions, thoughts, criticisms, throw it all into the chat and the Q&A. And when I'm done with the presentation, we will pick it up from there. So here we go. So we're going to kick off with a poll. So Adam, my colleague, is going to share a poll on screen to get you all started. And we will just kick off understanding where you're at right now. So interested in the audience, are you thinking about doing it? Are you on your way? Or it's something that you plan in the future, but you still have some thoughts? So we're seeing lots of movement there around your response to that. It looks like most of you are on your way by the looks of things, and there's a few who haven't started or it's in the future. So great. Okay. All right. That's good to know, because here's, I suppose, what you're all in for. To kick off the context and those changing perceptions of employees and managers, I think what's interesting about the past 2 years is we've seen a huge shift in behaviors in the employee workforce. And I don't think it's one thing. I think it's the combination of everything from COVID to hybrid and remote working to diversity, Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, the juggle, the work-life balance, and then indeed the Great Resignation, which I'm hoping we're coming to the end of soon. But indeed, just that whole concept of people wanting something different out of their working lives. And I thought what was interesting about this Great Resignation versus others is that we saw many people leave without another job to go to. So it wasn't the case that you were competing with a better salary or a better benefits package. It was more the case that people wanted something different from their working life. And I think the outcome of all of these changes in society trends is that performance got personal. And employees wanted more from the experience, and were kind of more demanding of that little bit more from the experience. And I think that's shifted performance from the traditional place of, gosh, what used to be known as the dreaded performance review, or the most reviled practice in HR, if we were to scream the former HBR articles, into something that could be much more meaningful, that could drive a really strong experience. And if you think about it from the employee's angle, actually performance can be a pretty inspiring place where we show up as a culture in our organization. So it's a means of where the employee can understand their line of sight to the contribution to the overall organization. So they can see, okay, what I don't do every day is really important because it's part of these departmental goals, it's part of this organizational strategic objective. So being able to kind of pull yourself into the bigger picture in a much more tangible, realistic way is really a strong motivator for a lot of people. Putting more places for growth, development, career conversations has really taken a center stage, and you see kind of the explosion of the talent marketplace and being able to kind of give people careers throughout the organization and being able to move them around with ease. I thought team is really interesting, and we're seeing a lot of shifts in performance into team goals, team rewards, team incentivization. So we're seeing an awful lot of focus on team. A word to the wise might be, don't lose sight of the individual accountability and ownership as you shift. If you're going in that direction to shift to team goals, which has become really popular, remember to ensure the individual accountability line is still there as well, because people still need to feel that ownership. And particularly in hybrid remote working environments, they need to feel that I know exactly what I'm responsible for versus what my colleagues and my peers on the team are responsible for. So being really clear about that, because we can't all just sit around, have a coffee in the office and sort it out anymore. We need to be an awful lot clearer about this. And then finally, my two favorites, of course, feedback and being valued for a job well done, but also being given the steer when we're off track or where we're not quite performing, and understanding, getting that greater level of self-awareness. We're not picking up the normal cues of office life anymore in a lot of places. So we don't have that validation that we used to get from a smile or a chat at the coffee corner. So we really need to make sure that we're embedding elements where the employee can become self-aware, can get that same validation and understanding of where they sit in the wider scheme of things, but to have that perspective and that reputation they can build on. And that kind of moves us into the trends. So how is that manifesting into performance management trends? Well, we're seeing really, that shift toward continuous crowdsourced feedback. That shift has been happening, I would say, over the past 4 or 5 years, but it really accelerated in the last 2. And what we're seeing now is not just we want more continuous feedback, or we want to be able to get feedback from our peers, but putting some real ownership back in the hands of the employee, so that if you work for a manager who doesn't deliver on that, you can still go and drive your own development. So we see an awful lot more practical tools coming into the process around that. I think the annual conversation for most people has been replaced with much more frequent check-ins, mid-year stop points. A lot of people have kept the traditional annual review at the end of the year, but it's much more supplemented with an awful lot more performance conversations. But I think people have become more sophisticated with those conversations, because it's not just, oh, you must have a one-to-one or a check-in with your people every month or every quarter, but they're getting a lot more specific about what you should be talking about, what is the discussion points on the agenda, helping managers have great coaching conversations. So an awful lot more prescriptive, I would say, on the check-ins front. Weighted annual goals used to be the old favorite. They're kind of out of favor now, being replaced by much more short-term and agile goals, and the ability to be able to create and review and modify goals throughout the year in response to the fast pace of work. So we do see a big shift in the goals conversations, and people playing around with the templates in terms of whether they're an OKR's house. I've seen some really interesting goals templates appear, which are almost like a hybrid between SMART, Agile, and OKRs. So people are kind of creating their own templates and merging kind of different concepts from different goals processes into their plans. So really a lot happening on the goals front, I would say. Calibration and that old rank and yank style to a curve is really gone out of fashion at this stage and has been replaced, I would say, in a positive way for People Days, which is much more about talent growth. How do we develop this person, rather than kind of just making the whole conversation about which position on a curve do they sit into. So I think that's been a positive move and has really helped people kind of have different conversations around that calibration time. Now, there's still a place for moderation. We still want managers to be talking about what success looks like, what great performance looks like. So I think people are still having those conversations, but the framework by which they have them is very different. Performance evaluation, we're seeing a big shift toward positive performance accountability. So again, those old school, I evaluate you and tell you if you're good or bad, those days are probably gone. And as Dave Ulrich would say, there's still a place for accountability. It's just done in a much more positive frame of mind. And I think, you know, that's the one pitfall I would say, is that the people who kind of threw out ratings throughout the end year conversation sort of had a second wave, I think, of reiteration, because they ended up realizing that there wasn't a natural place for those moments of accountability. And I saw a lot of companies backtrack on their previous decisions, which kind of undermines confidence. It doesn't play out so well, but people who moved kind of from getting rid of reviews and ratings to bringing them back and putting them in a different way. And you kind of can lose some ground if you keep shifting your philosophy, but certainly making sure that you have a place for accountability, I think, is absolutely key. And I think what we're seeing is a shift away from the process into the person, and making the experience much stronger for the individual going through it. One of the things that I see a huge debate kind of forming around is, you know, a lot of people have played with goals templates over the years. You know, they've switched to being OKRs or agile, or they've really bedded down SMART. And of course, there's a ton of different goals templates out there, and people kind of play around with various ones. But I think, you know, I was talking to a head of performance there a few weeks ago, and he was telling me that the business had said, you know, this OKR thing, we are absolutely confused. We know what we have to do. We're so confused about this template, because we know if we have to deliver 10 million in revenue, that we have to deliver 10 million in revenue. Whatever way we structure it is not the issue. It's how we get there. And I think this how we get there has become an awful lot more prevalent in an awful lot of people's minds, because behaviors are now shaping the journey of how we get there. And much more so now that we're not all sitting in the one office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and we have these remote practices and hybrid working, we're seeing that the how factor is playing a much bigger role. But if you think about performance, we do a huge amount of analysis on whether somebody has hit a goal or not, and how we structure the goal and template the goal. But we don't put the same rigor into how do we evaluate behaviors. How do we make sure that we're holding people accountable for their behaviors and how they're delivering? Because actually, if they get their behaviors right, maybe they get to the goal much faster. You know, if you're being, and it's often the tipping point to great performance. You know, if you ever hear anyone talk about great performance, they talk about things like the great collaboration that got a project over the line, or the incredible influencing skills that sales guy, you know, to meet his target. So people will often, you know, reflect on the how factor, but we have very little rigor in how we bring it into the performance process. An awful lot of people have embedded their values, but managers are at a loss as to how to talk about those things a lot of the time. So I see a big emergence around the rigor in this, and threading behaviors back into areas like feedback, check-ins, goals, so that we're normalizing that conversation around behaviors, and we're bringing that self-awareness to people so that they can walk into a review or a moment of accountability and be able to eloquently articulate how they think they're doing on those behaviors. But I want to move on quickly into the real practical considerations about transforming your performance management, because this is really where I suppose this webinar comes into some practical tools for you. One of the things to start with, and I think it's so obvious, but so overlooked, and I meet so many groups of people who have no purpose to their project. They've decided that performance management is dated. They know what they're doing is kind of a little bit last, decade, if you like, so they know they have to move on. But they haven't defined the purpose and the desired endpoint for their key stakeholders, for managers, for employees, for the business, for HR themselves, and for the CEO and the C-suite. And I think it's a dangerous thing to hop into a project without really doing your end stakeholder analysis map, because we need to decide what is it that we're going to deliver to these people at the end of this project. So before we debate whether we do crowdsourced feedback or monthly versus quarterly check-ins or the shape of the performance conversation or the development conversation, before you do any of that, we really need to focus on the big why. What's in it for the managers? What's in it for the employees? What's in it for the business, and so on. And that doesn't always have to be equal parts. I think sometimes I meet project teams and they're getting so caught up that everybody's got to win out of this new performance management. But sometimes you should be just doing it because the employee experience is poor. And this is a great way of showing up our culture. So the employee is the real target at the end. Or you should be doing it because your managers don't have the people capabilities to coach and to drive a high performance culture. So you want to give them more tools. Or you want to give the CEO some more analysis and insight into what's really going on under the surface of your employee experience and the performance practices. So there can be very different reasons for why you're going to do this, but having that very clear purpose is absolutely key. And the best projects I've seen, the most successful ones, actually started with a key purpose. The other thing to consider is the organizational readiness. And don't get thrown by this one, because readiness is twofold. One is I hear the people who go, my managers aren't ready for the big changes. They've already got a lot going on and we're just not ready to do regular feedback or regular check-ins or to change the performance practice. Let me tell you, they'll never be ready. They'll never be ready until you put it in front of them. In the same way that we weren't all ready to work on Teams. We weren't all ready to work remotely for 2 years. We weren't all ready to do hybrid. But when it's put in front of you, you find a way to get ready. So don't let the readiness factor be an argument for not doing things, because that's just holding back progress. Having said that, don't leapfrog into a ton of new practices that's absolutely going to overwhelm them and that they're not capable of pulling off. And I think they're the two big pitfalls I see: the people who move too slowly because they feel like nobody's ready, and the people who move too fast and bring in the very cutting edge of performance practices, and their managers just don't know what to do with it and become completely overwhelmed. So readiness, I think, has to be a balance between we're ready to do something new, but we have to challenge them to do something new as well. The next one is a poll. Adam, if you could just pull up the next poll for me. We're going to talk about different types of structures that you can use. So just to get a sense of where your performance management practices are right now, if you could pick one of your traditional is getting a real, a lot of people would believe they have a pretty traditional structure happening. Okay. And this is to be honest about your starting point. If you are in a traditional place where you only do mid-year, end-year reviews, pulling away ratings, doing feedback check-ins all overnight in one fell swoop, that can be dangerous territory that people aren't ready for. And I've seen it go really, really wrong for some CHROs And we're often pulled in after the mess to go in and clean up, and because it's been resisted and rejected as a new philosophy. So just be careful about your starting point and be very honest with yourself about your starting point. One of the things we do in Tandem when we first go into a client is we do a diagnostic tool to understand what the true starting point is. And you'll be amazed, with a global team, they won't even agree on what your starting point is, even if there's just HR people in the room. So having that debate early on, you might show up the poll there for people. I think people can see it, can they, Adam? Hopefully you can see the poll there, but there's a lot of people sitting in traditional. But make sure you're clear about where your starting point is and map your journey from there. The other thing I would say to you is a lot of people go after performance practices and they start thinking vertically or divisionally or regionally. So they start to go, well, in the US, we might want to consider these practices because this is how things work. Or, you know, this profile of staff, you know, are situated in these locations. So let's give them a different performance practice and so on. And people think very linear about their performance practices. One of the things that I would encourage you to think about is to think about the personas behind those areas. And there's about 8 to 10 personas that we've established, and clients will often pick, you know, 6 to 8 that really resonate with them. But think about things like the cynic, the person who's a bit worn out from all the latest HR novelties, or the overwhelmed manager who, you know, who has an awful lot on their plate, and how is it going to resonate with them? So start thinking about their needs, their pain points, and mapping out the change levers that you can apply to those particular pain points. And it will just give you a different lens about how you consider how your new performance practices are going to land. Also, bringing those personas into a stakeholder group that you can bounce ideas off is really, really powerful. I worked with one client and they had about 40 people in their persona group, different types of people from different parts of the business at different levels with different personas. And it was such a powerful group to give them a steer of what kind of sentiment, what kind of commentary would work versus what wouldn't work with them, how they responded to some of the communications, the design practices. It was just a super, super group to have kind of a safe place you could bounce ideas off before you let it loose into your wider organization. Okay, so now we're getting into the real practicalities of how do you actually go about the design phase and the implementation of performance. There is a couple of different ways you can do this, and I'm going to try and pace up in the interest of time. So I won't spend too much time laboring these slides, but they're important because the way you approach the design is, it can be very different just depending on which way organizationally you plan to roll it out. So you can have the phased approach, which is you signal that change is coming. You do some big symbolic things to demonstrate change and momentum in the business. So you might start with layering in new experiences like more real-time feedback, more check-ins for the purpose of development. You might simplify some of your existing processes, but you're not radically revamping everything at the same time. And then over time, you start to progress your journey with deeper levels, deeper change, bringing in greater levels of behavioral change, maybe changing your scales. We saw an awful lot of people shift from 5-point rating scales to 3-point on a journey with a view to maybe phasing it out over time or changing the terminology, but just getting people used to a lesser dependence on ratings. You might move to agile goals, maybe enhance the employee experience within the whole framework, give them more empowerment to do more in the framework as well. And then you kind of go harder and you double down and embed the change over time with new models, new talent management practices. A lot of people got rid of 9-box grids already. And then ultimately you accelerate, where you assess and review your organizational readiness to really go fast and to go hard and change everything. But you've kind of built up this gradual appetite for change, and over time people have got more and more used to the change. So that's one approach you can take. The next approach is this experimental approach gradually. And I have mixed views about this because I've seen it work well and I've seen it work, I've seen it not work at all. So this is where, and I see this with a lot of performance project teams. They're like, we'll pick our favorite people leader in the business and they're really warm to the new people practices, and we'll roll out to just them and see how we get on with them. So we kind of try and test some new techniques with them, and if it works with them, they can be champions to bring it to the rest of the organization. So you're staggering the introduction to the organization over time. Can be good, but here's the pitfall with it. One is you're very warm people leader already has a reputation of being a warm people leader. So practices that work in their place, other managers can be cynical to that, to go, well, of course it worked over there, sure, everybody loves her. And, you know, so they can dismiss the validity of what works for that particular division won't work for them. And then as well, you can go too small. So there's not enough data or sample sizing to bring a credible business case back to your C-suite because the data is just too small. The other really, I think the worst pitfall out of this approach is you don't get the same resources, energy, budget, and momentum. So you're trying to create this massive cultural change and you don't have enough resource or enough budget or enough momentum in the business to do it. So then, you know, you have greater risk of failure. And that's kind of one of the real pitfalls of this approach. But if you have a big enough sample size, if you have a strong enough business case to roll out, if you've got the buy-in of the leadership team, that maybe it's a phased approach, and I would avoid using the word pilot because everybody thinks of pilots as throwaway. So I would call it phase one of an approach if I were you. And then you kind of build up and, you know, don't go big bang, but you kind of simplify the experience for others. And you give the managerial capability. So that's another approach that you can take and that I've seen a lot of people use, some very successfully, but some really struggled with resource and budget. So that's a watch out on that one. And then finally, and I'll stop on the various approaches because there's, of course, hybrids of all of these in different times. You can go big bang, which is we completely change everything overnight. That, of course, can be a little bit overwhelming for leaders. So you've got some high risks with changing everything overnight and doing everything at the same time. So an alternative to big bang is you do go big bang or you start small, but you start staggering in different functionality over time. I worked with one client and they did this hugely successfully, and they would say that a lot of the success of them transforming their performance management was because of this approach. So they just changed things in gradual moments. So they changed the goals initially, you know, and just got people used to a new goals template. And then about 6 months later, they layered in feedback and check-ins and gradually got people used to those practices. And then next, you know, but they at no point did they announce, we're changing everything. They did announce a journey and a reason for change. So they had the big why covered. Why are we changing? Why is this important? But they didn't announce the big moves that they were going to make at the end of the journey. So they kind of revealed it, kept the reveals over time. They gradually unveiled different practices along the route. So I thought that was a really interesting approach, and I've seen a few others do it since, and it's been very successful. But you kind of keep your bolder moves to the end, if you like, and you move on your lighter things early on. So hopefully those different ideas are clear. If not, we can cover them off in the question time, which I need to move to quickly. So let me quickly run through. Finally, you need to cover off your change management. You know, a lot of people, we sell technology, and of course we love to sell our technology. But a lot of people go, oh, I just want to implement your technology. And at that point, we're like, hold up there. No technology in isolation is going to change behaviors without a strong change management plan. So you really need to be thinking about your change management plan. What are you doing on the leading, measuring, communicating, evolving, and learning front? And the most successful projects I've seen have put real time and energy into their change management practices. And that's something that we really believe in. Don't go launching off new initiatives and hoping everyone's going to log into your tech if you haven't clearly given them the big why, if you don't have some role modeling happening at a leadership level, if you don't have a robust communications plan. So these are the I find myself sitting in darkness. So these are the kind of things that you need to cover off. And of course, underpinned by the key dependencies. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on because I think this one is really, really a real tip for global organizations in particular. If you have a global team and you need a strong governance around how do we make decisions on design, and this can be really a challenging time for global teams to go, we are moving to one global way of working. And sometimes you don't need to. Sometimes you can have principles that are global with a lot of local flexibility built in, and that can be quite a success. But there'll be sticking points because in one area, certain practices will work. In another area, certain practices are well embedded and they're already working and they don't want to give them up. So one of the real secret sauces to making sure global projects work is make sure that you have a steering committee who are responsible for the key decision makers. So if you get locked in to things that you cannot make a decision on as a global team, you have a more discrete committee over here of maybe 6-7 people. Keep it small, keep it tight, who will ultimately make the decision. So you take the decision out of the room. And I think that's been the most successful practice I've seen, that if you want everybody, every global representative to agree on a new performance management practice, you're probably setting yourself up for a certain degree of failure. If you want them all involved, absolutely. Put that group together and make sure that they all have a voice, but don't allow you to get bedded down by every decision and it becomes a war. It becomes too big a fight. So make sure you have a place where you go, okay, we can't agree on this. We're going to take it to the steering committee for final agreement. And that's really, really successful. When you're thinking about your sponsorship of your project, make sure you have the CHRO, that goes without saying, but try and bring in a business sponsor as well, so that there's kind of somebody from the business who's co-anchoring with the CHRO to bring these new practices to the business. Your implementation team, make sure you have a really hot change management person on your team. They're absolutely critical. The doer, I don't mean the people who sit around talking about it, but the actual doer, the person who work with your comms team, the person who pull together with your L&D team to create the training and so on and so forth. And the ground floor influencers, those champions can be critical for when you implement. So bringing people from the business, employees, managers, executives from different parts of the business, and being able to bring them in early to help you with some of the decision making, but most definitely to get them to champion through your initiative. That's really, really key. And finally, don't forget to leave the embedding phase resourced well. Some people deliver the project and then the project disappears and nobody owns it, and nobody owns the tracking of success, the metrics for success, and so on. That's a mistake. Make sure that your team stay through the embedding phase until a post, far, I would say 6 months beyond post go live. Okay, I see the chat filling up, so I really need to move on. Let me just give you the final ones. Pitfalls to avoid. I'm just going to add these up because you can read quicker than I can talk. So here's one of the things that I will emphasize is metrics. Get your metrics really, really clear up front. So don't kind of come out with generics around, you know, oh, we need to have a feedback culture. What does that mean? How often should an employee expect to receive feedback? What kind of quality are we looking for? What is the expectations of managers giving feedback? So be very specific and granularly measure it. How many feedbacks happened in a certain period? At what level? Which way is the feedback coming? Is it upward? Is it downward? Is it peer-to-peer? Are we seeing more praise rather than constructive growth? Measure, 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 because all of that fills up not only your business case, but also your success metrics to bring back to the business to go, we are now this culture. We have moved on our feedback culture and so on. So it's really important to have very clear metrics up front. And finally, you know, Einstein would say you can't use an old map to explore a new world. And I think we would have the same view. An awful lot of people are still using old fashioned concepts that were really developed in the 80s for an 80s world. And it's time to move on from that and really freshen up the experience. And from a technology perspective, I guess we would be of the view that you can't use an old platform to explore the new future of performance. Performance management has moved on enormously in the last 2 years. And if your platform doesn't reflect the world that we live in and have shaped over the past 2 years, then it's not really going to be fit for the future. So think about the technology that supports you, and of course, get in touch with us if you're in that frame of mind. But from there, I'm going to stop sharing because I'm conscious that I want to leave lots of time for your questions. And there's loads happening on the chat here and questions. So Lauren, help me out.
Yes, you've had a lovely few amount come through. So to kick us off, Kirsten asked, how will you manage expectations of the employees with a focus on their careers or development? Because there's often limitations which then create challenges for performance management.
Yes, this is huge. And I've seen people kind of go out and promise the world and then have none of the backup to deliver on it, and it creating a lot of resentment. One of the things that you've got to be really clear about is what's in it for the employees? What is the deal here? If they get access to more development conversations or more growth-oriented ways, what is the output of that? Does that mean that they take ownership over their own growth and they have to go onto your e-learning platform to discover more? Or does that mean that you're providing a lot of interventions like mentoring, shadowing, breakfast with the bosses, all of those other kind of softer external conferences, networking opportunities? So are you creating a list of levers of interventions for them? And one of the things I would say is to be really explicit of what the deal is for employees, because overpromising is probably one of the worst things you can do. And I've seen a lot of companies put in lots more opportunities to talk about career and growth and development, but have very little to follow through on. So you're raising the expectations and then frustrating your employees that you've nothing to deliver on it. But one of the things you can do is to get them to think about the growth through the how factor. So what are the behaviors and the self-awareness that they can take with them and show up to their managers? So how do I represent me, my personal brand in this organization, and be ready for the future opportunities that are coming? So there's lots of different ways you can play with it, but I hope that kind of some way answers the question.
Fantastic. And to follow on from that, Vijaya asked, how do you think we can bring the impact dimension to the overall performance management, shifting performance mindset to an impact mindset?
Yeah, love that question. And I think this is the new goals that we're starting to see, is kind of a move away from I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, to actually reframing the goal as this is what I will have delivered and this is the impact it will have made. So people are really even starting to bring it into goals language and reframing the goals. And you've lots of nice new little toolkits and models that have arisen around this, which are really helpful, that I don't have time to share on the call today, but they're actually really cool. The other thing is that one of the things that I was really passionate about when we were building Tandem is, how can we measure the impact of the experience of performance management? Because actually performance management often lands quite differently for different diverse groups. It lands differently for your females than it does the males of your organization. So have we done enough to remove the biases that can exist? So analytics is super helpful. And I suppose one of the things that we've worked hard on the platform is the analytics capability behind it, to be able to not just measure the outcome, how many goals are linked to the strategic goals, what kind of behaviors are showing up in our organization. They're all no-brainer things. But actually, what are the insights that, when I look across the experience for all employees, what do they get around here? What's the deal? How often should they expect to see feedback? How high quality was the check-ins? Do my women get the same level of feedback to my men? And is it of the same quality? Because are my women only getting positive feedback where my men are getting more constructive and growth-oriented feedback? So really kind of diving into your analytics and insights is really key for that.
Mm. Yeah.
I see Julie here going, what does WIF mean? That's what's in it for me. So anytime you're creating your, that early stage of purpose and stakeholder mapping, there should be a what's in it for me for all of your stakeholders, for your managers, for your employees, for the business, and so on. It's a really powerful exercise to do early on.
Fantastic. So we also had an anonymous attendee. They said they're currently working on transforming their traditional performance system, but their main struggle is then linking it with reward. Once they've linked it, you need some kind of ratings or some kind of distribution guidelines, which then takes away the focus on the developmental feedback. Do you have any best practices on this?
Yes, there's a lot of different models you can use here. So you can kind of layer in different experiences, the feedback that's for development versus the feedback that's for performance. So to actually split, and it's one of the things on the platform we thought long and hard about, because we were very much conscious that if somebody gives you feedback, it's a very different outcome if they mean that for your development than if they mean that to sit in as part of a performance discussion. And you know, for those people who've got rid of who've got rid of ratings entirely, there is new comp models forming around internal talent practices, which is a combination of market rates added with performance overall performance, looking at the whole experience of performance, delivery of goals, behaviors that show up, and so on, and potential combined. There's a few models have emerged on it, and I think there's a real link between taking all of that and feeding it into comp. But we're seeing a shift in comp actually from people looking at annual comp practices into reflecting their performance strategy back in. So things like real-time comp. So I deliver certain goals, I get paid out for it. I receive a certain amount of feedback for something, I get a short-term incentive. Managers have more flexibility around the rewards, but all governed within overarching guidelines. So we're starting to see the comp practices really change and reflect the new dynamics of performance management, but that's probably a whole other webinar.
Yeah, it definitely is. So one person mentioned how they're currently managing expectations and they've been using the 70-20-10 rule as a guide. So lots of on-the-job training, projects, buddying, self-leadership ownership. They say it's your career, you own it, and your development.
Nice. Yeah, I really like that approach. And I think the more we can put tools into the employees' hands for development, the more we can safeguard and mitigate against those managers who never quite get it right. Yeah, and there's always a few. So I think it's a huge trend around putting more and more tools so that employees can go seek their own feedback from multiple stakeholders. They can request a check-in when they're ready to have that discussion. So not just waiting on the HR process, but kind of more fluidity around, you know, because if an employee has been headhunted and they want to think about their career and it's top of mind for them, there's no point in your check-in career conversation being at the end of the year when, you know, they're thinking about it right now. So giving them greater ownership over being able to proactively go look for those conversations as an employee themselves, I think is really helpful. So there's lots of things you can do to kind of empower employees and put it back into their hand. And 70-20-10 is a nice one.
I believe that's all the questions. If anyone has a last minute question, really quickly, you've got about 2 minutes left. So if there is anything, no. So Amanda said lots of concrete information drilling down on the conceptual level. So many thanks, Aisling.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope today that we've provided some practical tools and things to think about, particularly if you're starting on the journey and it's still top of mind for you about how do we get going. The most successful companies I've seen have done incredible things around how they kicked off the journey with purpose, put strong governance in place, great change management, great technology to support it. And remember that a lot of what you do is symbolic to people as well. So the messaging, you know, even that signal of we're using new tech, we're using a different way of approaching this, you know, they're all big messages that are going out to your people that signal to them we've got a culture change here. It's much more than just performance employee. It's just more than performance management. It's a whole new employee piece. So yeah, I wish you the very best on your journeys. going toward these transformations, of course, we're here to help. So do get in touch if you're starting out on your journey or thinking about a new way of doing things. We'd love to talk. So do reach out to us with all the usual links. I'm sure somebody somewhere is putting a link into the chat. And thanks very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really great session. This will be shared, and the recording and the PowerPoint. So if you did miss the beginning bit at all, you will be able to watch that back. So no worries there for those of you that did ask in the chat as well. We do have lots of more upcoming sessions throughout the year as well. So please do keep your eye out and join any other Tandem talks. If you follow us on LinkedIn, I've just popped that in the chat now. You can also keep up to date with us there. So when you see any of our webinars go live, you'll be able to sign up and join. Otherwise, thank you so much, Aisling. Really great speaking with you. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Really great participation, and I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye, everybody.